Hey, welcome back to Gold Derby. I'm Christopher Rosen. I'm joined by James Newton Howard, an eight-time Oscar nominee and the composer of countless major films and beloved classics. My Best Friend's Wedding, The Sixth Sense, King Kong, and now News of the World, new film from Paul Greengrass starring Tom Hanks. And James's score is up for actually a Golden Globe award this weekend in the Best Score category. James, I wanted to start with News of the World. Obviously, this is your first film with Paul Greengrass. How did this collaboration come together, and how'd you get involved? I guess.
Paul says that he's wanted to work with me for years, so I'm going to believe that. Although he was working so successfully with John Powell, I would wonder about that. But no, I think Paul wanted to work with me, and I certainly, was aware of Paul as being a really interesting filmmaker, and I was excited for the opportunity. And Billy Goldenberg, who's the editor, very fine editor of the movie, called me up one day. I've worked with Billy on a number of films, and he said, "Do you want to do a Western?" And I said, "Yeah." And that was it. I flew out to the set in New Mexico last, November of 19, which was actually the last time I ever set eyes on Paul. We haven't seen each other since. But we had a great meeting out there in John Ford land in the middle of the New Mexico desert. It was just beautiful. And yeah, we decided to take it on.
What were those conversations like? I think you've done. I was looking. You've done so many films. I know Wyatt Earp is one of the films you've written the score for. That's a western, I would say. But what were your, what you guys discussed? This is, I think, a different kind of western than Wyatt Earp is, and certainly maybe more along the lines of those kind of John Ford films. I know Paul has cited like The Searchers as like at least a spiritual influence, if something like that. I guess what did you guys talk about for how you wanted this to sound, and how you approach that?
Well, he was very concerned that it not have too polished a quality, and which I completely understood, because this is a period of time in the country where everything, truly everything, was kind of broken. Certainly, the fabric of people's lives was broken. Nobody had any money. There was a huge amount of acrimony between both sides. So people were just trying to make their way back into civilization again. So he talked a lot about the character of Jefferson Kidd, and that he was a wounded soul, that he was a loner, that he was kind of traveling through town to town reading the news and carrying with him this feeling of some quiet grief that he had, that you don't really know what it is. But so actually the movie the score was very quiet for the most part, certainly through the first act and halfway through the second. Um, and Paul and I decided, we came up with this concept of a core group of musicians that we called a consort, which would be like a couple of viola da gambas, old cello de amores, gut string fiddles, something a little more roughly hewn, and that would be our broken consort. And then around that, where things got bigger or warmer, wherever we needed it, we would, excuse me, we would surround it with a more typical orchestra.
Hmm.
So that's the way it sort of started.
Yeah, it's a great score. You mentioned William Goldenberg, the editor. I actually spoke to him this week as well, and he was saying how I was talking about one of my favorite scenes is actually after there's a, for those who haven't seen the film or whatever, there's a big shootout kind of scene on a hill, and then shortly after, Jefferson Kidd, who is played by Tom Hanks, and then Johanna, who is the young girl he's trying to take home, played by Helena Zengel. They have like this moment on their carriage where they kind of like really converse for the first time, even though they don't speak the same language. And it's like very emotional scene, I think. And like, you really get a great sense of Helena's performance too. It was just so good. And Billy Goldenberg was saying how like that scene originally didn't have a soundtrack, a cue for that scene. And you kind of like did fold one in there, and it works so perfectly. I guess, can you talk a little about like that kind of being able to do stuff like that, where you're like, oh, like I actually think as music in this part will actually heighten the scene and make it even better than it already is.
Well, I think somebody with Paul Greengrass's confidence in terms of as a filmmaker, that when he hires somebody, he wants them to help. He wants them to help him realize his vision, for sure. But he also expects them to come up with ideas that perhaps he doesn't have. Otherwise, what's the point? There were a number of places where I tried putting music in where there wasn't any. That particular scene when they're together in wagon felt like they were on a platonic level, obviously, really falling in love with each other. That she was trusting him, she admired him as a hero. She performed with grace and bravery herself in the shootout. And so it seemed like a good place to introduce really the main theme of the movie in a very quiet way. With you wouldn't think piano in a Western set in the 1870s was a good idea, but it's very gentle piano and some strings, but it really seemed to play their growing love for each other.
You've done so many different genres, obviously, like we were mentioning. Like, do you like when you're doing a Western score like this? Do you are you and not that you're gonna like obviously like kind of like crib off of other scores, but do you go back and like do you kind of like do you give yourself an opportunity to like watch other westerns just to see how they did it? Or I mean, maybe you don't have to because you're so familiar with the genre. I guess like how's your process like that from that standpoint work?
Well, I knew that the kind of my Western score was going to be rooted in more of the classics. For me, if I think about a Western, I often think of Dmitri Tiomkin, or I think of Alfred Newman, How the West Was Won. Um, that to me is one of the great themes of all time. So I'm not thinking, and plus this is pre-20th, this is 19th century. So Aaron Copland isn't born yet. So I'm not going to refer to Aaron Copland style of music, but that wasn't a conscious effort. You just kind of respond intuitively and instinctively to what a film wants to be, and you hope that we all agree on it. And the main theme, I think, from the movie it really came as a result of how quiet Paul made the Tom Hanks moment when he's reading the news. You almost feel like it's a church-like setting, and there's something sacred about this space. So the idea of a hymn kind of evolved on piano. And since I'm a pianist, that was kind of easy to do. Not a very good pianist these days, sadly. But, I could play that piece. And yeah, so I guess I'm more rooted probably in the when it came to westerns. In yeah, I've seen a lot of westerns and I love them.
Yeah, you mentioned like the church-like quality. I'm thinking of like the opening scene when he's reading the news for the first time, and you kind of are introduced to that character, not even sure, if you're going in cold, or you're not sure if you haven't seen the trailer, you might be like, what is this guy going to be doing here? And it's like really, you do get that sense of like, yeah, like it's like a very quiet church-like kind of like moment. It's very good.
Yeah, it sets the mood. It shows you that this guy. Well, you see the scars on his back. You see that he's a loner. And I think I wrote that cue at least 20 times. Not completely different, but 20 variations of an idea. And I think finally what the cue says more than anything is about solitude, that there's a quietness about him, that he's carrying something with him that we don't know. We won't know what it is for several acts to come.
Right. You mentioned solitude. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic where you and I are doing this on Zoom. I know, I believe you recorded most of this score, it seems, remotely, right? Like with like the orchestra separated in different spots. Can you talk a little about that process? Because obviously, like you said, you went down to the set last or fall of 2019. The pandemic hits in the winter of 2020 as you're probably working on this score. Yeah, like what was like, how does that even come together? And like, it seems like that's such an incredible challenge to pull off. I'd love to hear about how you were able to do that.
Well, really, it's recording remotely is not particularly unusual. I mean, I think every composer's done it to some extent. Um, this score really it worked quite well. The big difference was that Abbey Road, where we recorded in London, which normally I can put 100 musicians in it, they said, well, we could put 40 in it. So everybody was appropriately spaced, and then the engineering was really the star of the show because the orchestra played in a wonderful way. We were set up in what's it called? I forgot what it's called even. We had some um, link just like that worked in real time, that I heard exactly what they were hearing there in London, and there was very little delay. And we just would have to oftentimes do performances twice, record them twice just to get the numbers, so it really felt like 80 people playing instead of just 40. um, but in another way, I think you gained a certain kind of personality in the score because you can hear individuals. I think it was particularly great for our broken consort, because the people that play those instruments a lot of those people play those instruments in London. Um, so it was and shortly after that, I did a score here at Sony, but Sony wasn't open at the time. So
Wow.
it,
Yeah. No, it's wild, and I mean, listening to I read that after that you had done that, and I was like, you can't obviously you can't even tell. Like when I was listening to my headphones, I was like, oh, this sounds. I would have never known there was any kind of like like you said, like lesser like you had like how you didn't have the full complement maybe, and you had to double it up and stuff. So yeah, no,
Well,
that's really
Jonathan Allen gets the credit for that. A really wonderful British engineer, and then it was mixed by Sean Murphy, who's a guy I've been working with for 1,000 years.
yeah. So I mentioned at the top here, you had eight Oscar nominations. I wanted to just talk a little about that. Your first one was for Prince of Tides. I guess I know you kind of like what you were obviously. People maybe know you from with Elton John and all these different things. Can you talk about like what do you remember from that first experience of being nominated for that film?
I hadn't obviously I had not being nominated before. I didn't expect to get nominated. I didn't really even know. I mean, you get woken. It's kind of fun. You get woken up at 5 in the morning by your agent or manager, and I couldn't go back to sleep. I remember that. I think I was smoking at the time, so I think I went out on the porch and had a cigarette. And I think one of the first people I talked to actually was Alan Bergman, because I'd been working with Alan and Marilyn on a song in that movie. And they said, write it down, keep a journal, remember this. This is a really special moment in your life. And I didn't write it down, but it was unforgettable because it was thrilling. It was really exciting. Um, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to talk about too, about from your one of the things I was looking at, like you've been nominated for, like One Fine Day, your original song nominee. You had My Best Friend's Wedding, obviously we mentioned like the score. Um, Junior, I believe, right? Was that another one for original song? I feel like nowadays, like those are like bigger, maybe like studio comedies or like kind of like those kind of films. I feel like maybe I've gotten away from having like kind of these kind of scores. And I guess like how have you noticed like you've done so many different genres. I guess how have you noticed how the industry has evolved from that from like a score standpoint where it's like like a comedy now maybe isn't going to have that kind of memorable score that maybe like My Best Friend's Wedding did almost 25 years ago or whatever.
Well, I think I try and approach every movie with the dictum, there are no rules. And I certainly think that I'm not patting myself on the back here, but a sophisticated orchestral score, melodically based, is still entirely possible. It just has to be the right movie. But I think there is a different expectation on the part of filmmakers now, more electronics, which I fully embrace, and I love doing electronic scores. Um, Maybe leaning less heavily on thematic material. But ultimately, I think writing music for a comedy is largely about timing. You just I did a couple of movies with Barry Sonnenfeld back in the day, and Barry was just a master of timing, and would help me with an entrance or getting out, clearing a joke, but I think I really enjoy doing that. I find a way to really relate emotionally to whatever movie I'm doing, and in Best Friend's Wedding, for instance, or Dave, um, there were parts in there that were really moving and genuinely funny, and I just try and enrich the experience without ruining the actor's performance.
Yeah, I think you've done a great job. Those are amazing movies. And I guess last one, your most recent Oscar nomination was for Defiance, I believe, in 2009. But it's like you've gotten the last decade. I was just looking. It's like off the top of my head, I'm like, oh, you did Hunger Games franchise. You did like Fantastic Beasts. Obviously, this film, which is great. Nightcrawler, I think, is a great score. I love that score, and I love your work with Dan Gilroy. I get like if you were, I'm sure you don't do this for the awards recognition, but I mean, like, what would it mean? Like to get nominated for this film, or do you not even want to talk about it or jinx it or anything like that? I just find that like, obviously you're still producing at such an incredibly high level. Every score is like a home run. So yeah, like what would it mean now to get like an Oscar nomination, maybe like a decade after your last one, I guess.
You know, I, you always hear people saying, "Oh, it's such an honor to be nominated," and fact is, it is an honor. It means your nomination comes from your subgroup, which means your colleagues think enough of you to single you out. So um, it'd be really fun. Randy Newman said to me, "When you get nominated, it's like having your birthday every day until you lose, and then it's like, yeah, whatever." But and I think he's right about that. I think when I got the Golden Globe nomination, it's just a very fun, light thing to happen in this rough time we're all going through. So I think it would mean a lot to to my wife and to all of my friends, and to me, of course. It's really fun. It's a film I'm very proud of. I think Paul made an excellent movie. He gave me a great musical opportunity. Um, I tried to take advantage of it, and the rest is out of my control.
Yeah, and it is a great movie, and I think it's really appropriate for the times, like you were saying. Like I think with the message of the movie about how how coming together after such a fractious period, and like the way misinformation and information travels, it's very timely and very pertinent to I think a lot of the conversations we've been having for the last few years, and especially this last year. So yeah, News in the World, great film. James Newton Howard, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Good luck this weekend at the Golden Globes, and yeah, thank you so much.
Nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you. Thank you.